I'd like to welcome everyone to the webinar today on the roles of codes of conduct in safeguarding practices. I'd like to acknowledge, in the first instance, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which each of us are working from today. And I'd also like to pay my respects to the elders, past, present and emerging, and to welcome any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people who are with us today. I am Harriet Witchell, and I'm the CEO and founder of My Cluedo, which is a marketplace for investigation professionals. And today is our 9th webinar for 2020, and I'm delighted to introduce Simon Davies, who's the Director of Safeguarding Services, which is based in Victoria. I would like to remind people if they could keep their microphones off unless they want to speak. Simon has said that he would like people to ask questions during the presentation and have it more of a discussion. And I think that in previous webinars, people have really appreciated that interaction. So if we can do that, that'd be great. We are recording the presentation today, and so you will be sent a copy of the recording if you need to leave at any point, or forward it on to colleagues later. So let me introduce Simon. So he was in policing for 20 years, servicing the military and Australian Federal Police before he moved into an ethics, professional standards and safeguarding role in Catholic education in 2014. He's a guest lecturer at the Pontifical Gregorian University in Rome on writing safeguarding guidelines and policies. He's the Director of Professional Standards for the Australian Province of the Society of Jesus, and he's also the director of his own consulting firm, Safeguarding Services. Simon has undertaken countless investigations involving reportable conduct, grooming, sexual assault, professional misconduct, corruption and fraud. And today he's going to be talking to us about the critical role of codes of conduct and how they come into safeguarding practice. So I believe that Simon can share his screen. And so I'll pass over to you, Simon. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Harriet. I'll attempt to share my screen successfully now. Please let me know if you can't see that. Hopefully you can. As Harriet said, more than happy to take questions during the presentation rather than you bottling them up till the end. I prefer that, so good back and forth is nice, and hopefully Harriet will kick in with some, chase me up if I've forgotten anything during the presentation as well. As Harriet mentioned, we run Safeguarding Services, which is a consultancy. We specialise in the safeguarding of children. We're not an organisation that is all things to everyone. We don't do, say, workplace bullying, etc. We just specifically do child-based investigations, policy advice and training. So that's a little bit about us, and a big thank you too for My Cluedo for having us today to present to you. Today we'll be looking at what is a code of conduct, the basics, some of the fundamental elements that I think are important in a code of conduct. Looking at how to write a code of conduct if that's a task that you have to undertake in your organisation, and really the key to embedding a code of conduct. It's great if you've got these policies sitting on shelves, but pretty pointless unless you bring them to life within your organisation. We'll talk about how we go about doing that, and we'll take a quick look at some case studies as well as where codes of conduct can really come into play and be of use to organisations. And then obviously more Q&A if there's any at the end, but as I said, please feel free to ask during. So let's take a look at what is a code of conduct. A code of conduct is an essential governance document which may state the rules, values, ethical principles and vision for your organisation. Having a code of conduct in your organisation provides staff and volunteers with clear standards and expectations of how to perform their job, and which you'd expect most large organisations have these. Very interesting, coming out of the Banking Royal Commission of recent note, is a lot of big companies are really making these documents front and centre on their websites. Just doing a bit of research for this presentation, it's interesting, years ago, it'd be sort of 6 links away to find their code of conduct because they didn't want you to necessarily find it as a customer. But now they're pride of place on usually the front page of their website, which is good to see. But obviously, we're talking about child safety in particular here today, but it's interesting that, other organisations really value codes of conduct. And two government organisations I've got there on the far right, the Victorian Public Sector Code of Conduct. And certainly just from personal experience, when I was in the police, I was in professional standards, which is internal investigations, and all investigations really done internally are based on the Code of Conduct, so the Australian Federal Police Code of Conduct. And without it, really, you don't have a benchmark to investigate against. If you think about it yourself, if you're investigating someone's performance or behaviour in an organisation, if there's no document like a Code of Conduct to measure that performance against, how then do you make a determination about whether their conduct was appropriate or not? For me, in my experience, I see it as a key document. I think it's I'd probably go on a limb to say I think it's one of the most important documents that an organisation can have, if I'm honest. I think a lot of other documents potentially can be motherhood statements, like vision statements, all great, I think, for employee morale, or this is where we're heading. But I think from a really good governance document that you really need when the rubber hits the road is a code of conduct is essential. So now let's have a look at a child safety code of conduct. And there's a big difference between the two. A code of conduct generally will talk about a range of things like use of assets and what have you, whereas a child safety code of conduct is really focusing on interactions with children. And they're designed to identify to leaders, staff and volunteers the expected behavioural standards for engaging with children and young people in the organisation. It should set a high standard of conduct for the protection and wellbeing of children and young people. And it should cover conduct in both the physical and online environments. The Royal Commission, which we'll look at shortly, was very big on this. A lot of code of conducts in the past used to focus on the physical environment, where a lot of offending was occurring online. So it's important to have that element in the code of conduct.
Could I ask a question? It's Tracy. Are you suggesting that an organisation within a child related industry would have two codes of conduct then, one for the child safety as well as their code of conduct?
Great question, Tracy, and thank you for stealing my thunder, but it's a good time to insert it. So my personal view is I prefer a one in all in code of conduct.
Yeah.
I do know that what sector are you in?
Well, I'm in the investigation sector, but
Right.
I came from the criminal sector previously.
Yeah, okay. So in the education space, for instance, Tracy, the Victorian Regulation and Quality Authority, which oversee schools in Victoria, they suggest that you should have two.
Okay.
But that's not my personal preference. My view is, and I'll take you to a code of conduct that we've assisted in writing, is really, in my view, if you're going to why treat a child differently? How you should treat an adult. You should just treat everyone well. I think obviously there are specific protections that need to be written in for children, and we'll talk about those later, like the protection of images of children is important. But I think in relation to treating people, you should just treat people well.
That standard should be up here. Yeah, so I'll wait until you go on, because I've got another question particularly about community standards these days now. So I'll leave that and let you keep going. Yep.
Okay.
Thank you.
But yeah, good question. And yeah, as I said, my view is I prefer a one document. I think because two documents too, it just becomes confusing. Well, which one are we referring to now? So just for that practical aspect as well. Now, a critical element, I think, to any child safety code of conduct is be easy for people to access and understand, and it be covered in induction training for all staff and volunteers. And in Victoria, in the education sector, that's actually mandated. So there has to be induction training for all staff and volunteers within an educational space, and that has to include coverage of your code of conduct. Important that it links to relevant legislation, the organisation's child safety and wellbeing policy, and other related policies and procedures that impact on that code of conduct as well. Important also to tell people that's critical if you do see a breach of a code of conduct, how you go about dealing with that, who it needs to be reported to, etc. And also linked to the relevant human resources and procurement processes in the organisation. For example, recruitment processes, individual contracts or terms of employment. And that's really that one in all in code of conduct. You might be talking about, use of assets, use of IT equipment. So it's important to have those procurement processes, etc., in there that cover off on that type of behaviour as well. Why are they important? I think from a situational risk perspective, assessing the opportunities for abuse to occur in the institutional environment, there are typically two elements to situational risks. One is exploiting opportunities to be alone with a child to facilitate grooming and or moving from innocent relational behaviour to an unlawful sexual act. The other is the opportunity to form a close relationship that could involve physical or emotional contact that precipitates crossing of code of conduct boundaries to abusive behaviours. Really what that's saying is the code of conduct goes a long way to deterring that behaviour. So one is a deterrent to say to anyone joining the company, this is how we expect you to behave, or this is how we expect you not to behave. So grooming opportunities are reduced, so that situational risk is reduced. But also if that perpetrator does go over the line to undertake that grooming behaviour, then it's called out quickly by other staff who might view it and they know, well, I know the code of conduct well, that behaviour isn't appropriate and I'll report it to the appropriate person to deal with it. So it's highlighting those situational risk issues. I think I just wanted to mention too, a comment the Royal Commission made about leadership within institutions is integral to conveying cultural norms. Leaders set the standard regarding appropriate behaviour. If, for example, institutional leaders practice and exemplify their own code of conduct, particularly in adhering to the consequences for breaches of the code, this influences the message conveyed throughout the institution regarding inappropriate behaviour. That breaches of the code of conduct are considered serious. And I think this is, I'm probably getting ahead of myself, this goes to embedding the code of conduct within your organisation. As I said, if it's just sitting on the shelf and it's not being utilised, then it's pointless and it won't be embedded into the culture. And the Royal Commission really went to talk about that cultural change element within organisations. I think too, if I'm a Joe Blow staff member, I've seen bad behaviour, I've reported to management, and then I don't see anything, any results of that report, what's the point of that code of conduct? So you're going to lose staff pretty quickly in embedding that culture. Just moving on to the fundamental elements that I think are important in a code of conduct. I think values are essential in a code of conduct. I think, although I did say at the start, I think value statements aren't as critical as a code of conduct, but I think there's nothing stopping you from incorporating them into your code of conduct. Really setting the tone about management expectations around values for the organisation. These are some of the ones I've taken from the education sector that I think are useful. Being curiosity, instilling a love of learning and a sense of wonder within all members of the learning community. Respect, developing an understanding that all individuals are unique and can make valuable contributions to the community. Once again, not focusing on children, we're saying all people within that educational community should be respected. So we're not breaking it down to just child safety. It's about just good relationships with people, with humans. Compassion and empathy, fostering respectful and supporting partnerships between students, parents, teachers, and the wider community on the learning journey. Excellence, empowering all students to achieve and celebrate their personal best within a culture of high expectations. Perseverance, building a sense of determination and optimism when faced with challenges in learning and life. Inclusiveness, promoting a sense of belonging through collaboration and mutual respect based on the principles of integrity, honesty, and trust. So, great statements to lead into a code of conduct, really setting the document up with a tone and where it's heading. The next one is expectations. And I think, and just focusing on if we're just writing a child safety code of conduct, I think some of the key elements you'd put under expectations are interactions with children, positive guidance, so the old discipline, which has now been reframed to positive guidance. Conflicts of interest, I think, are essential in any organisation. Supervision, What are the supervision standards of those children in your care? Physical contact, what's appropriate and what's inappropriate in a child-based environment. Boarding, overnight stays and sleeping arrangements, critical if they apply to your organisation. And transportation of children. I think a lot of people question why transportation of children is particularly mentioned. You'll find that if you read through the Royal Commission, if you read through the thousands of pages, a lot of historic complaints arose out of transportation of children. That either the offender, took one child to a location and offended, or multiple children and just there was no notification to the organisation they were doing that. So that really comes out of a lot of learnings out of the Royal Commission that's specifically mentioning the transportation of children. As I said, these are expectations around just a child safety code of conduct, but certainly in a all-encompassing code of conduct, you'd be looking at using resources appropriately, fraud prevention, all of those kind of good things you would in a normal commercial company. Also, bathrooms and changing rooms should be specifically mentioned if they apply to your institution. Obviously, bathrooms will, but whether you have a need for changing rooms, like if you're operating a ballet school or what have you. Grooming is a critical element, certainly in the professional space within safeguarding services. Most of our work is in the grooming area. Very hard to detect, as you know. It goes for long periods of time. But I think it really needs to be called out within codes of conducts and looking at the kind of behaviours that make up grooming, so that as we talked before, that risk element can be removed if at all. Images of children is an important one. I think more so for two reasons. One, for internal people, who may have a predilection to pedophilia, that they, be blockages be put in place from them storing images, creating a treasure trove, if you will, of images of children, but also to really inform staff that there's a privacy issue here, to remind them that, these children have rights about their image, where's it shared, and not to allow the identification of children so that predators external to the organisation have easy access to those children. So they can, really build up an intelligence profile of that particular children. This is where they go to school. This is their full name. Here's a photo of them. It just allows that opportunity. And professional boundaries. What is appropriate within the context of teaching, of ballet teaching, of whatever the context is, of child minding, etc. Electronic communication, I think, is a fundamental one. And happy to have a discussion. I know it's a bit of a hot topic. Facebook, I know, is a bit passé now with kids, but certainly Instagram and all those other social media accounts, is it appropriate for people within an organisation to be connected with them on social media, and communication boundaries there? Because certainly professionally at Safeguarding Services, a lot of our investigations revolve around inappropriate electronic communication. I'm not sure if anyone wants to give their viewpoint on whether they think electronic communication with children is appropriate, or whether friending people on social media is appropriate.
I was going to ask that exact question, Simon, because it's very interesting. Some sectors, let's say when you're using the ballet class, I've got experience with swimming schools, for example. The New South Wales public education system is, like in any state, is best practice. I mean, teachers cannot have Facebook accounts, for example.
Yes.
They all do, they just have them in other names, not in their actual name. But they're not allowed, and if they were found out, that would be a breach if they had a Facebook account and there was any of that communication. But when you get into the private and independent school sector, it all starts to get a little bit wishy-washy, really. Yeah. And I would hesitate to say my experience has been the independent school sector is not as best practice as what the public school sector is. And then when you get down to things like swim schools, ballet schools, you would think that they would also have conditions that people, the teachers, trainers should not be having any social or electronic communication with people as well, because that's where all the trouble starts. So yeah, I'm interested in people's thoughts on that, because they seem to think maybe their code of conduct doesn't specifically say it, for example, in the swim school, but there is no way the male swimming teacher should be Snapchatting with the 13-year-old girl who's swimming, asking for her to upload pictures of her in her cosy, for example.
Couldn't agree more, Tracy. And I think you're right. Certainly the government sector is a lot more strict on this because you have one code of conduct covering, say, 500 schools in Victoria, whereas really each independent school, it's up to make their own rules on this. But certainly I'm all for there shouldn't be any electronic communication outside of, agreed email on a work server with children. It just shouldn't occur.
Hi everybody. It would be unusual and frowned upon and prohibited in Catholic independent schools or systemic schools for teachers to engage socially with students on social media. And that's been in the policy settings for a very long time now. I wrote the first one of these about 10 years ago for independent school in Sydney, Catholic, and it's not a point that's argued anymore.
I don't disagree with you. I don't disagree with you, Michael, but I do notice the language you used. It's frowned upon. Frowned upon is a big difference between
prohibited in the code.
Prohibited.
It would be an actionable event if you saw a teacher engaging with a student on an unapproved site. The school will approve sites and it will shepherd that interaction onto its own platforms because it's a useful tool. There's all sorts of things done to tell them that the rugby game's been moved from
agreed.
to Waverley 1 or something, So it's and you're not exclusive on that site. There'll be other teachers involved in it. There'll be people supervising it. It'll go through the school's IT system.
Exactly.
But the guy talking to the kid late at night on Snapchat, if that came to light, that would be investigated and treated as misconduct.
I think too the other issue that gets a lot of discussion is once a child has left the institution, how that interaction is occurring. The way we have expressed and I'll show you the Jesuits Code of Conduct is that it occur only if the child makes contact with the teacher. So the contact can't be initiated by the teacher to the former student, for instance. It has to be the other way around. And it has to be usually in a professional context. So say LinkedIn. LinkedIn's a good example because it's not social in a sense, it's more professional, and you've got young people who have left school trying to make their way in a career and they'd like to develop their network. That brings up a lot of discussion professionally around is that appropriate or not.
Again, clearly addressed in codes of conduct in Sydney Catholic schools and Edmund Rice education now as well.
Yeah, certainly Edmund Rice education.
7-year prohibition on contact with ex-students on social media.
Yeah.
7 years.
There can be an argument around the question of mental health, keeping an eye on the mental health of some students, and that access to their social media or parts of their social media can assist the teachers in keeping an eye on someone who's being bullied, really struggling with their mental health, having suicide ideation. So, especially in the flexible learning area in the Edmund Rice tradition, but and in others, youth workers are confronted with this constantly. So it's not quite as simple as all of that.
Great.
But again, not on your private. You wouldn't want those interactions on your private page.
Yeah.
No. You'd be going through corporate pages or approved, and you'd be letting the school know if it's part of your job. And I had those roles. If it's part of your job, I'm not doing that privately, and I'm drawing other professional people into that conversation with me, whether it's the counsellors, the pastoral staff. I'm letting the boss know.
Yeah, important distinction. Absolutely.
Yeah, I just wanted to reiterate what David was saying actually, because in mainstream schooling of any variety, it's relatively easy to say you don't do that. But when you start to get into many smaller programs, areas where they're dealing with very vulnerable young people, they're young people dealing with younger people, and so they they are born and raised in social media. Often young people only communicate through social media platforms. So making sure that organisations have specified what the right protocol is for social media in that agency or organisation or program is probably appropriate, rather than just a blanket kind of, no, you don't do that.
The other thing I was going to say, not to make the conversation more difficult, but there was an interesting case that some of you will be aware of at Padua, not to pick on them, down in Victoria, where a teacher took the issue to the Human Rights Commission, basically saying that he had a relationship, let's for argument's sake agree with him that it was a friendship until the student finished year 12, and then it turned into a sexual relationship. The school terminated his employment, and he took them on in the Equal Opportunities Commission, actually got up on it to say that by the school restricting his lawful rights as a human being to have an engagement with that student post-school, that it was a breach of his human rights. So quite interesting. And I think, to Michael's point of that prohibition of 7 years post-school, you've obviously had no one take him on, but it'd be interesting to see if you actually had an industrial dispute about that, whether you'd win it. I suspect there'd be a fairly good fight.
Could I just put to everybody, if somebody, let's say the students left the school and it's 7 years down the line, what foundation would there be for the school to bring any action now anyway, when the student's already left after 7 years?
I think what you're looking at there is not that event on its own. What's the prohibition about? It's about making sure that no one working for the school, a teacher, did not prepare a student for this relationship post-school. So you wouldn't be pushing all the alarm bells simply because you found an interaction online between a teacher and an ex-student. You'd put that in the context of what else you knew about that staff member and his or her relationships with students, and that one in particular. You'd be looking for continuity in the relationship between what was going on before they left school and what was going on afterwards.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay.
That's how I'd be placing it. Look, and one of the things you have difficulty with is rural communities where the teacher is in the local AFL club, and there's a 14-year-old kid in two teams below him, and they mix up at training and they know each other's parents, and it becomes very. You've got to bring a lot of nuance to this, and a lot of pastoral wisdom has to be deployed in it.
Exactly.
It's not always clear cut where if there's how you apply the rulings.
The other big issue too, Michael, I know is schools struggle with is you might have had year 12s have just finished and they come back in their first year of uni, say, to coach rugby or football, and they're obviously friends with their brother's friends and other year levels on social media. But I always say, well, it's about them transitioning to realisation that they're now employees, that they need to sort of think about removing a lot of those friendships on social media if they want the role as a coach.
The Royal Commission identified the employment of ex-students as a high risk factor for
Absolutely. And I think, to be honest, I think the Royal Commission didn't really say, sadly, didn't say a lot about it, but I think student on student offending or young people offending, that's the next big bubble to blow, I think. And I don't think schools are managing it overly well.
No.
If I can move on from electronic, it always gets a lot of discussion, electronic communication. I think it's here to stay. The next key element, I think, is application, being clear about who the code of conduct applies to. I think, easy with staff and volunteers, but I think sometimes I see codes of conduct as a bit vague about if they apply to contractors and subcontractors, for instance. As I say there, most codes of conduct will apply to all employees, managers and executives. And obviously the code of conduct will apply to volunteers. But contractors are a bit of an element that needs to be looked at. And links, including references to other relevant policies, procedures within the organisation, being complaints, discrimination, bullying, conflict of interest policies that may exist, and including references to relevant legislation also is important. a key element, I think, in a code of conduct too is the consequences. I think from a deterrent perspective, if you've got someone looking at, a predator looking at joining your organisation, if you're very clear on consequences of breaching your code, it certainly would make someone think twice, I believe, from joining your organisation. And a statement about the consequences and failing to follow the code of conduct. And important to advise where necessary that certain breaches of the code of conduct may also constitute criminal offences, and that the organisation takes those seriously and will report them to authorities. Just briefly on writing a code of conduct, and having done this process on a pretty large one, consultation is key. I can't stress this enough. I think, unless you're getting everyone on board on the journey, it just doesn't work. If you as management develop a code of conduct and then just issue it, you're just not going to have that buy-in as you would where if people feel they've been part of the process, they've been engaged. I think the other key consultation area is unions. Certainly in the code of conduct we wrote recently, we went out to all unions in the various states and really engaged with them about their concerns about the different elements of the code of conduct. And surprisingly, when we embarked on that journey, I thought, this is going to be a nightmare. We're going to have pages and pages of backlash from the unions about different elements of the code. But surprisingly, I think everyone was on board reasonably, a few tweaks here and there, but pretty good in the main. And that if you'd like to have a look at it, you can Google that online. That's the Australian Provinces Code of Conduct. We've just done a big review. So that came out in 2018. We've just finished a big review. And I think a review is key. From an operational perspective, it's the people on the ground that go, well, we've had this in place for a couple of years now. This element is a bit hard, or it's just not working in an operational context. Can we look at that? And re-engaging. And even in the consultation process initially, we developed a draft and then sent it out to, I think, over probably around 1,000 staff via SurveyMonkey, and just got their input and a lot of buy-in. And that was great from an operational perspective, to people on the ground saying, we think this would read better or this would work better. And we've done that process again in the review. So really sending it out to everyone in the organisation to get buy-in and say, what hasn't been working so well, or what could we tighten up on here? Just wanted to mention briefly too, I think a student code of conduct is important as well. In an educational context, or even at the ballet school, how are you expecting those students to behave with each other as well, and also with the adults in the organisation? What expectations you have of them, I think, is important. Just on the code, I think another thing we've done, I don't have the example here, but the Royal Commission talked about it, is putting the code into child-friendly language as well. We did a big project where we went to junior years, middle years, and then senior years of an array of students, and obviously led by the appropriate leaders, to take them through the adult code of conduct, to then turn it into their language. And after that, we just distilled all that information and made it into a poster. So it's a one-page poster that can be put up in bathrooms, put up on notice boards, etc., around schools, around institutions, that really lets kids know that in their own language, this is what you should expect from the adults that are dealing with you in this institution. And that's got a lot of positive feedback. And once we got the graphic designer to do the last version, we went back and took it to the students just to make sure they were happy with it, and really focused on their intention from that document. And that really ticks the box as well in child safe standards around engaging children in things that matter to them.
Was it only, Simon, directed at how the children can expect teachers to interact with them, or did it govern their conduct as well?
No, so that's a separate project. So the student code of conduct, that's another big project, and that's engagement with students about how they should behave with each other and how they should behave towards teachers, for instance.
What about the recent examples of the two schools' scavenger hunt lists, for example?
Yeah, so that would really boil down to
it was appalling and sickening to see that any child themselves would come up with that list.
Absolutely, and that would boil down to a student code of conduct. And I think that those documents, and I'm not a principal of a school, but maybe Michael will want to kick in on this. Is I think when it does come to suspensions and those kind of discussions with parents and with students, having a student code of conduct is useful for those conversations to say, well, Johnny was well aware of the expectations of the school here, and you've breached those. But the project I was talking about, the poster, that was really specifically about children being aware of how adults should
interact with them. Okay, yeah.
So just looking at embedding a code of conduct, I put this slide up. This is the Victorian Child Safe Standards. And I think it's important to note that protecting children it's a multi-pronged approach. There's not one document, not one practice that will protect them. It's really a myriad of things, really encircling the children to protect them. And I think a key element to that is the code of conduct. So these are all things playing in partnership through the governance of the organisation, commitments to child safety, human resources practices, everything coming together and working in harmony to really protect children the best you possibly can as an organisation. I think obviously training is key. Victoria have mandated that at least annually teachers in schools receive training around the code of conduct and safeguarding generally and abuse, and really embedding that in your training practices annually, or hopefully more than annually. I think signed acknowledgements are key. Some states have mandated this, that there's an acknowledgement that you understand and agree to abide by that code of conduct. And really promoting the code of conduct. I think, bring it up occasionally in staff meetings or team meetings, looking at different elements of it, breaking it down. But I also think too, in that encouragement of peer-on-peer supervision, I guess, if you see someone straying in their application of their professional practice, really pulling them up and saying, hey, that might not be in accord with this element of the code of conduct. And as I discussed previously, having a child-friendly version of that code of conduct so children can really be informed about the expectations that you have as an organisation of the adults within it. And as we said earlier, I think acting when a breach is observed of a code of conduct is critical. Otherwise, people will just lose faith in management and also the code of conduct. One study I like bringing up with people that I find quite interesting, it relates to, it's a study done by about the New York Police Department and police corruption, but I think it really translates as well to educational environments or school or environments where children are. It talks about, and I'm summarising a 400-page report, but it talks about, it took a number of extremely corrupt police who'd been, found for, corruption, etc. And then it tracked their careers back right from when they joined the organisation. And it basically, every single case boiled down to a lack of pulling these people up from an early stage. And really that boiled down to a code of conduct. So, for instance, you might have had a very junior constable in the New York Police Department who might have taken the police car home for the night, which is against the policy of the organisation. But they were never pulled up on it. It was let slide. For whatever reason, their supervisor thought, it's pretty minor, I'm just going to let it slide. But really what that allowed that corrupt police officer to see is test the boundaries. Okay, the sergeant will let me get away with that. Let me take it up a notch. I'll see what he'll let me get away with next week. To the point of them becoming seriously corrupt people and, as I said, fraud, corruption, all the rest of it. So it's really about ensuring that code of conduct, no matter how minor the breach, it's called on and the staff member is, in an appropriate manner, but is pulled into line, because it's really showing in the organisation these boundaries are hard boundaries. They're not soft boundaries.
I'm probably not the only one, but when you've got historically, the person taking the car home, for example, and then somebody's in the organisation being, adhering much more to the code of conduct, and then they turn around and say, well, for the last 8 years, I've taken the car home every night and Harriet never said anything to me.
Yeah.
That's what you're right, Simon. It's not embedded. So, and it's very hard to say that person then has breached the code of conduct if for 8 years everybody knew and nobody did anything about it.
Exactly, and I think also, from a staff morale or organisation morale perspective, if other staff are doing the right thing and they see that person taking the police car home, it's like, well, why am I getting pulled up? Why should I care here? I'm just going to not follow the rules as well.
Simon, I'm interested in your thoughts on about this embedding in a large organisation.
Yeah.
I think it's a challenge with any policy that to have, for any policy in any large organisation, to have that policy live in the minds of people and staff is a really big challenge. I mean, back in the day, Occ Health and Safety was stuck on the shelf as well, and it sat there. Things changed over the years. Got put up in the kitchens and in every workplace, and everywhere I looked, there was another sign about Occ Health and Safety. There was an Occ Health and Safety officer that walked around the office, talked about it, we joked about it, we took it seriously, all that sort of stuff. Now, that hasn't happened with this safeguarding of children in our schools yet, I don't believe. I think we've got a long way to go.
Yeah, I agree.
So I'm interested in your thoughts on how to best embed this into schools or large institutions.
Yeah, look, I think if depending how large they are, but if you've got the finances, I think certainly a dedicated safeguarding person within the organisation who's a bit of an expert in the area. But unless you've got management on board, unless they see this as critical, whether it's safeguarding or anything else, it's not going to happen. It needs to be top-down led. I think too, putting it on agendas, I've seen a lot of schools start to put safeguarding as a standing item on say board meetings. I think although that can be notional, I see Michael disagreeing. It can be, I think, but it brings it back on the agenda. I think if it's to a certain extent it can be notional, but I think too if it's not there as a reminder, it can get lost completely. I think also too I see a lot of big schools developing child safety officers. The only thing I'd say about that is, and the Royal Commission have talked about this, is typically, sadly, schools will say, okay, who wants to be a child safety officer? And people will nominate to be the child safety officer. I'd like to see the opposite, where the students nominate who they'd like to see as the child safety officer. Because interestingly, our perception of who, I think he might be a good child safety officer. The students might, for whatever reason, Michael's a good guy, but they just might not have that, relationship with Michael. They might have the relationship with the maths teacher because he just clicks and he connects and kids like talking to him and disclosing things to him. So I think it's about getting that buy-in from the students who they'd like to see as the child safety officer rather than us as adults directing who they should be. I think that's a critical one. So there's some of the things that I see some of the really good schools doing that. The other interesting idea out of the Royal Commission was to have children on interview panels. So if you're interviewing for, say, a key leadership position, principal of a school, why not have a kid on the interview panel? That sort of questioning or concerned emotion that we have as kids gets beaten out of us as adults. Kids are really good at detecting if someone's not quite right. And if you've got them on the panel from an early stage, they can put their finger on the pulse and go, there's something not right sitting with this person, and you might move on to another candidate. So there's some of the things I think that are important.
I've promoted that without too much success. I think I haven't really got that up over the line. But what I like about that idea, along with other things like regular student surveys, graduate surveys, all these things that put safeguarding up the front. If you're a deliberate offender and you're targeting a school and you walk in and you see a kid on the interview committee and you hear all these other things in induction around what the school does, you're out of there. You're not going to hang around.
Absolutely.
You're going to move to somewhere far less monitored, where no one really talks about safeguarding. You're going to go off to a sporting club or a dance studio or somewhere. I don't want them to go there, but what I'm saying is you've put a cop on the beat. You're listening to kids, you're hearing kids are taken seriously. Look, they're on your interview committee.
Yeah, exactly.
I think it's a strong protective behaviour, even if the kid doesn't contribute much in the interview.
Exactly.
There.
Exactly.
It's strong protective behaviour.
Exactly, but also too, even if they don't contribute, I think for even the student cohort to say, oh, isn't it great Johnny was on the interview panel?
Yeah, absolutely.
Word travels around and you've got a lot of buy-in, more buy-in probably than you did have from students previously about that. Yeah. The other thing too, I'd say, David, just in relation to codes of conduct, I think as I talk to different staff groups is that feeling that, oh, it's a big stick, the way it's written, there's a lot of don't do this, don't do that, you know, and management coming down on me. I think it's about nuancing the language sometimes as well. It's about, sure, putting the don'ts in there, but then some really good wording around, you know, a teacher can be a critical person in the student's life. We encourage you in that and to form relationships with appropriate relationships with students. I think just nuancing the wording sometimes and putting that context to it before you lead into the don't do this, don't do that, can go a lot better in embedding a document like that.
The Columban missionaries, who I do a lot of work with, when we wrote their first policies, because they're part of CPSL now, one of their regional gatherings rejected our first drafts because of exactly that. They said it's too negative. How do you pitch this differently? So the second version of it, the regional director and others found some language, what they called it safeguarding as ministry, and promoted the positive aspects of safeguarding.
Absolutely.
Which I thought was a real nice shift in the language.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think too, and David, I think you've seen this slide, and a slide I like to show to, especially in the Catholic sector, is I find a lot of teachers say, you know, we've got all these child safety elements and safeguarding through the roof because it was a priest problem. And I like to put up statistics coming out of the Royal Commission that actually it's a male problem. Whether you're celibate or, you know, whatever, or you're ordained or not, it's a male problem predominantly. And I think we need to own that. And I think we need to talk about that more. There needs to be a lot of communication that men, you know, have violence in us or have predilection to that kind of behaviour. And that needs to be owned, because I think there's a real risk, especially in the Catholic sector, of teachers saying, you know, oh, that was the old days, you know, when priests used to be in classrooms and teach and brothers aren't there anymore. It's all lay people now, so it's okay, it's safe. It's, you know, and Harriet can attest it, I'm not out of work, you know, on live matters. So obviously something isn't translating there. I think, you know, statistically, you're always going to have crime. That you're stupid if you think you're not. But to me, I think it's still at a level that isn't acceptable. So I think that point as well is good to point out to lay teachers, that this is a continuing problem and we need to be on top of it.
Yeah.
Thank you, Simon. That was great. I just had one question that I think we've got time for, and I'm interested in other participants' views on this too. But often when we're dealing with misconduct, the circumstances of cases are often not your average situation. So they're always, well, in my experience, often exceptions to the rule. So where there may have been pre-existing relationships between the teacher and the student through some other connection, whether it be rural communities are particularly vulnerable to that, where, yeah, so you've got an existing relationship either through family connections or through other organisations that may have a less stringent safeguarding regulations, such as sports clubs. And I realise that those agencies are all getting much more on board now, but there's still, I think it would be natural to anticipate there's still a lag between the schools where they have invested time and money in making sure they've got great policies, and other smaller clubs where they haven't got the resources to do that. Yeah. So do you have, I'm interested to know whether the agencies that are developing the codes of conduct, if there's a way to capture the conduct from non-school based interfaces or activities within your school code of conduct. So yeah, so I can see the puzzlement on your face. Maybe my question wasn't so good, but you know, how do we capture outside activities in the school code of conduct?
You mean outside behaviours of workers in the code of conduct?
Yes.
Well, I think that the reportable conduct scheme's good at doing that in both New South Wales and Victoria. You know, really, you're not off the clock. No. If you're an organisation that's captured by it, to be honest, I'd like to see national reportable conduct schemes. I think probably it's one of the best things for safeguarding, certainly in Victoria. I know New South Wales has been running it for a long time, but I'm glad it's been expanded to encompass a lot more organisations now in New South Wales as well.
Well, what you don't do is pass religious freedom bills that weaken workplace protections.
Yeah.
Like all the stuff they're talking about now, all of a sudden takes the tools off employers, their ability to police the conduct of workers outside the formal workplace. And they're important protections to retain, both for workplaces in general misconduct, but for schools and groups like ours who want to keep an eye on the behaviour of relevant behaviours of employees outside of ours.
Yeah,
so, I mean, you just can't weaken those protections.
Agreed.
Okay.
But, I think too, just as a side point, Harriet, to your point about resourcing, it's sad that I was on the phone the other night to an international conference about safeguarding, and what they're finding internationally is because of COVID, it's basically, okay, we've got to tighten the belt here. What's first to go? Oh, it's safeguarding. They're really pulling in the reins around. So I'm glad I haven't seen that in Australia yet, but certainly economies overseas, they're really shutting down safeguarding officers or reducing staff numbers, etc. And that you know, that'll be a challenge in the international context, and hopefully it doesn't happen here. I'm conscious of the time, but I did want to just briefly, I'll just mention them to you. You can read them on your own if you like, is Royal Commission Case Study 2, which talks about the YMCA. It's quite a good case to look at about really how key a code of conduct is, and it could have stopped a lot of behaviour. Although they had a code of conduct, it wasn't overly specific. And two, it really wasn't enacted. There was a lot of behaviour Jonathan Lord was undertaking that should have been called to account pretty early on, and probably his employment terminated, and it could have saved a lot of children. And you can read that on your own. The other one is Case Study 12, and that relates to an independent school in Perth. And that talks about a lot of behaviours observed and reported, to be fair too. You know, colleagues reporting it to management, but management choosing to do nothing about it. And it wasn't until students had left the college and reported it to police that action was taken. But sadly, a lot of boys were harmed before that occurred, and it was over a long period of time. So once again, code of conduct in place, but not being people not being called to account and being held to account against it. That's all I had, but more than happy to take questions, or feel free to go if you need to have lunch or etc.
Simon, just one question, and thanks for the presentation. When you did the work where you were surveying the other teachers and also the students, were there some suggested changes which were unexpected or surprising to you?
An interesting sticking point that we found with it was actually a lot of debate around it, is yelling. So obviously in the discipline area, it talked about, you know, yelling at students is inappropriate, and they felt that was an important one to have on the poster. But the school, the adults in the school said, well, what about sports coaches and on the sporting field? We've got to yell because you've got to get your message across. And they actually watered it down. And I said, but once again, and it's a mindset change, once again, you're demeaning the children's position. They've created that poster. It's for them. That was the yelling component was important for them to have on the poster. The adults, you know, flown in and overrode that position. and eroded that child engagement. So that's probably the point that sticks out with the most. But I think the kids were great in engagement. I think they were really engaged, and I think really excited to be part of the process as well. I think, which was, you know, buoyed everyone. I think that they're really invested and engaged in their own safety, and I think it's nice to see the culture changing as well. Is that you know, that it was this topic that wasn't spoken about, but now it's got a lot more notoriety, and, you know, with matters like St Kevin's that get a lot of media attention, kids are much more engaged in their safety and want to know about it.
And did the teachers give any sort of practical suggestions about, in a sense, things that they see on the ground that could be improved, that would improve safety for children in terms of colleagues' behaviour?
Yeah, I think, to be honest, and I do a bit of work with Stephen Smallbone, who's probably, you know, an expert in this area, is that situational risk mitigation. And I think for me, a key element is, and Stephen is big on this, is looking at the physical environment that you're engaging in. And that's a lot of work. And I think sometimes we get either overwhelmed or tired with it, is going around your physical environment and saying, how can we improve this? Is it appropriate that we conduct that teaching session in that dark, dingy room because that's the only space we've got? And sometimes it is. Sometimes it boils down to money. We can't change that room now. We may be able to in a couple of years' time. But it's having those discussions. You know, how safe, kids, do you feel in this environment, etc. It's simple little things like glass indoors, etc., that we've all heard about. But interestingly, I sit on Melbourne City Council Child Safety Committee, and I said to them, why isn't it at a federal level we're having the discussion with the legislators who write the building code? So you wouldn't link necessarily the building code of Australia with child safeguarding, but why don't we change the building code to say, if you're building a new school, here's what you have to do. You have to have glass, you know, pretty much the school has to be glass. You know, why don't we legislate that? But we still haven't in Australia gone that far, I think. And that's where I'd like to see us get to.
It's pretty, in the design of new buildings, it's given a lot of thought, it is. And the good architects that schools routinely use now, yeah, and have that concept in place. So I think it's, yeah, you know, the design.
I'd like to see it as legislators, disability, for instance, in the building code, like, you know, door handles. You have to have certain door handles for disability requirements. There should be that kind of level of legislation, I think, around schools, and not be relying on good architects.
No, true, yeah. Like other WHS legislation, it could be.
Yeah, exactly.
The other thing I think is important is post-investigation of an incident, don't just stop. Have a moment with the leadership group or whoever's been involved in managing the incident and just say, well, what have we learned?
Couldn't agree more.
What have we learned? Where were the systemic failures in this?
Yeah.
Down to, did we roster enough teachers on that event?
Yeah.
You know, when did the boss or the deputy stick his head into that class to see how things were going? Like, who took that young teacher aside when they saw he was getting cranky over the course of the term?
Exactly.
You know, we pushed the kid against the wall, you know, like, what have we learned from this?
And I don't think that's just safeguarding, Michael. I think that's across the board in any investigation. Absolutely. But I think but that comes down to bravery of leadership too, because sometimes you don't want to look at the systemic issues because you don't want to know where you went wrong. It's easy to just terminate the teacher.
Yeah, true.
That's brave leadership, but I think it's critical because 100% of the time, there's a systemic issue that led to that failure.
Always. Yeah. Teachers aren't very good at what I call distributive justice.
Yeah.
What did we all do? And sometimes when I'm looking for some mitigation for a teacher that I don't particularly want to lose, I look around for what else did we all do that contributed to this? When did this train leave the station?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
And I think that fits in, Michael, very much with the bystander issue that we've been experiencing across all misconduct, which is you know, we're all watching We watch it happen, but we don't act. And it impacts on leaders as well as everybody else. But I think those things are beginning to change.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, one school where I used one of Harriet's recommendations to investigate, because I was a bit close to the leadership group, but I helped them manage it, was they had a very good policy for risk managing excursions. They had a big event in the school itself on a day that took teachers and kids out of their normal routine in class and never did a risk assessment for it.
Yeah.
Because it wasn't an excursion.
Yeah.
If they had risk assessed this incursion, they would have ticked some of the boxes that, had they ticked, might have prevented the incident.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it's just little learnings like that, you know. It's
Yeah.
But they don't get learnt if you don't talk about them.
Yeah, but you've got to discipline them, and you've got to have a fight with them.
Yeah.
Sometimes to really do the debriefing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll just share very quickly. Thanks for that, Simon. So my role at one of the GPS schools, the Scots College in Sydney, is I'm the Director of Workplace Law and Child Protection. I'm also the college's in-house lawyer. And it's really interesting. For the last 3 years, I wouldn't say reportable conduct is gender specific, because I can look back at the number of investigations that are quite equally where allegations were made against female staff members as well as males. If I'm not investigating, then we've certainly done a huge amount of work in that cultural space. So I'll just share a couple of things. We have a T to 12 staff meeting every term, and one of those meetings is dedicated purely to child protection. So what we've done is we've brought in Janet Shura, who's the Commissioner for Young Children at the OCG. We've had Commissioner Robert Fitzgerald address all our staff. And we've also had Deb Defina come in and spend some time workshopping with some of our staff. Child protection is really a compulsory agenda item at all our staff meetings and also at our faculty meetings. And I think what we've embarked on at Scots is to make sure that the way you see work health and safety and the way you see first aid, it needs to, if you choose to work at Scots, it's part of our language, and it's introduced at the very beginning when you come for an interview at Scots. So we've certainly done a lot of work in this space, and there's a colleague of mine up at Knox who's also a lawyer. We've got a lawyer that's employed in one of the schools in Brisbane, and I think having somebody independent that is so at arm's length when you're dealing with a big investigation really holds the school in very, very good stead.
Oh, absolutely. And I think too, from a stakeholder perspective too, Bradley, I'm sure, your parent cohort would be very appreciative that there's some independence there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, good on you. That sounds great, doing lots there. You just need to keep the kids under control now with muck-up day.
Simon, could I just ask, you made a comment, and I don't disagree when you referred to male behaviour, for example. What's your thoughts these days? And it could be that there's more of it happening or it's reported more, because that issue of the female behaviour. Bradley, when you've commented that it goes both ways, do you think it's being reported more, or there is an increase in female behaviour as well?
I think, to be honest, I think just statistically, you know, it's a given. Males tend to offend in this area more. Yeah. But I think females are smarter. I think men are just a little bit stupid and easy to catch. I think if a woman is going to involve herself in behaviour like that, it's a lot more covert, smarter, and probably harder for school police to catch them. But certainly the matters that I've dealt with, and serious, sexual offending with multiple students of a female offender, they've been very, very smart in how they've gone about it, and very good at, coaching the victim as well. I think there's that element too of preying on young men, having been a young man myself, of that element of, you know, I'm a young man, he's the good looking teacher, we're having a sexual relationship, high five sort of thing. And I've seen it come to light later when the student is older and they've reflected on it and say, actually, I'm not as comfortable as I was when I was a kid doing that. And it's come to light later. So I think there's those nuances as well. Whereas I think young women, when the old crusty, you know, maths teacher has a crack at them, yeah, they'll speak up about it more. So I think there's all those nuances as well about reporting too. Yeah,
because that issue, perhaps, and I don't want to play down the conduct because it's inappropriate anyway, that it's almost more, I'm going to use the words relationship-like, like there's no, I mean, the female is grooming and things like that, but they're almost engaging in a consensual sexual relationship, although the child can't consent, as opposed to some of the behaviours that we are probably acknowledging that males engage in, which is perhaps, if you're going to put it on a scale, much worse. But that issue, perhaps sometimes when the male students' parents find out about the sexual relationship as well.
I agree, and I think you hit the nail on the head with the term you used earlier, social norms. I think sadly there's still those carryovers of social norms that you know, it was okay. It's a female teacher with a male student. That's okay. What are they complaining about? So I think there's still an element of that as well.
Yeah.
All right. Look, does anybody have any burning questions before we let Simon continue with the rest of his day?
Simon, what's the can you got a reference to that Human Rights Commission case you quoted?
Yes. What I'll do is I'll send it to Harriet and she can email it to you if you like.
Yeah.
Thanks, mate.
Yeah, that would be great. All right. Well, I'd just like to say a really big thank you, Simon, for that presentation. I think that was really, really informative, and I can tell by the level of discussion and conversation that everybody got a lot from that. So thank you very much for that. And just to remind everybody, next month we're going to be hosting somebody from Whistly, which is a whistleblower service, and they're going to be talking about the needs, how we meet the needs of whistleblowers. So I hope some of you, if you're interested, will join us for that webinar as well. And in the meantime, enjoy the rest of your Tuesday and this lovely week. Thank you very much, Simon.
Thanks, Simon. Thanks, Harriet.
Thank you.